What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about Evanescence, who I think may be one of the very most underappreciated bands in metal. And what I mean by that is, like, yes, pretty much everybody knows who they are, but I think there's a lot of people out there who kind of think them as somewhere between a one-hit wonder and a meme.
Wake me up inside. I can't wake me up inside. Save me.
But the truth is that they were much more than either of those things, with a much bigger impact and influence than I think a lot of people realize. And their music actually held up a lot better than most of their nu metal peers. Like, to me, they really should be in the same conversation as bands like Slipknot, and yet, for some reason, they're oftentimes left out of those discussions. They put gothic metal on the map for a mainstream audience. They were a huge gateway into rock and metal for millions and millions of kids, and I think they're really only now starting to get the credit that, honestly, they've always deserved. And all of that is exactly what I will explain in this video. But first, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there's a link to that in the description of this video. And also, thanks to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video. As you may have seen, I've worked with Trade for quite a while now, and they've sent me a bunch of great new coffees to try. The way they do it is you take their survey where you tell them how you like your coffee, whether you like cream and sugar, what kinds of coffees you like, that sort of thing. And then they match you with the best roasteries based on their network of experts who taste test all of them. Like, they sent me one from Cafe Vita here in Seattle. I think it's a lot of fun to see what they send me every month and from where. And they also have a great guarantee. If for whatever reason you don't like it, they will send you a brand new bag for free. And right now, Trade is offering new subscribers a total of $30 off your first order, plus free shipping when you go to drinktrade.com/rock. Or click the link in the description of this video. That is more than 40 cups of coffee for free. So get started by taking their quiz at drinktrade.com/rock and let Trade find you a coffee that you will love. That's drinktrade.com/rock for $30 off. Evanescence started out back in 1995 in Little Rock, Arkansas, by the vocalist and essentially only permanent member of Evanescence, Amy Lee. And Amy was only like 14 at the time, but she was already a pretty serious musician. Her father was a radio DJ, so she kind of grew up around music. She also took classical piano lessons for almost 10 years. She did choir and wrote her very first song when she was 11 years old, called Eternity of the Remorse. Very emo and gothic, even in 5th grade. And her original dream was to be a film composer. And that was kind of the original concept for Evanescence. Amy wanted to combine her passion for classical music like Bach and Mozart with her love for grunge and alternative music. And all of that came together when Amy met Evanescence guitarist and co-founder Ben Moody at a Christian summer camp. They decided that they were going to start playing music together. They started playing local shows, and they were still in high school, at coffee shops and open mics, that kind of thing. And in 1998, they released their first EP on an indie label called Big Wig Enterprises. Followed by another EP in 1999 called Sound Asleep, and in 2000 a release called Origin, which was kind of somewhere between a demo and an album. It's almost like a rough draft of their first album, Fallen, in that it has 3 of the songs that would go on to appear on the album, just with much less polished production because these were essentially home recordings that Amy and Ben did. But it does have some pretty cool songs that aren't found on any other release. And Origin was released in pretty limited quantities, somewhere around like a few thousand copies. And it's become kind of a cult fan favorite after they blew up, although Amy herself is pretty critical of it.
I only think they really love it so much because I won't just give it to them. They're just trying to say they're the biggest fan because kind of sucks. I mean, I was really young.
But despite being kind of rough, it was enough to get the attention of a label called Wind Up Records, which you may know as the label that had signed Creed a couple years earlier. And as much as people like to laugh at Creed, they did sell like 10 million albums, which means that Wind Up Records had money to really invest in Evanescence and help them develop to their full potential. At the time that they got signed, Amy was actually going to school in pursuit of her original dream of being a film composer, but she dropped out. The label moved them to LA, got them an apartment, and connected them with a variety of different coaches, including an acting/performance coach to help Amy with her stage presence.
I have to like turn on our music that we were working on. We were like in the studio or writing at the time. Turn on Bring Me to Life, whatever, on a boombox and like act it out with no mic, like just faking it, pretending like the nerdiest thing you could possibly imagine. But I had to like make eye contact with him.
And they really did invest in the band. They worked with Evanescence like that for nearly 2 years before finally deciding that they were ready and connecting them with a producer to help them create their first album, Fallen. And here is the first of many times where the band cracked and really almost fell apart when the label started applying a lot of pressure to them to change their music to be more marketable. Here is what their A&R at Wind Up Records says. Before going into the studio, I remember listening to Bring Me to Life when he turned to me and suggested that as powerful as the song was, there was something that he was hearing that wasn't there yet, a rapper. And the problem was that this was definitely not what the band wanted. They didn't want to be seen as like the female Linkin Park. And more than that, if this was going to be their first big debut single, they didn't want people to think that they had a male singer. And to Amy, it was even more than that. It almost felt like the label was saying that in order for their music to be seen as valid and marketable, it needed the presence of a man. And so the band did something that I really respect. They just said no. They moved back to Arkansas with their parents. The label pulled all their backing, and it looked like that might be the end of Evanescence. Like they would have to start over from nothing all over again. But eventually they were able to reach a compromise. The band agreed to have a rapper on Back to Life in order to get on the upcoming soundtrack to the Daredevil movie, and the label backed off in terms of further interference with their music.
They were like, okay, we have a movie opportunity and we're gonna let you do your thing, but you do have to have the rapper on the one song because they specifically asked for it. I don't know where that came from. So we said, okay, we'll take it. Rapper in one song.
And it turns out that the label may have actually been right because, as most of you know, their first album, Fallen, was an almost overnight success, selling over 2.5 million copies in just 7 months. It went as high as number 3 on Billboard, and they got a Grammy for Best New Artist in 2003. But all that success also created a lot of pressure. The band was obviously happy about the success of Back to Life, but they were also concerned that they would be a one-hit wonder, and that fans would be disappointed when they listened to some of the other songs and realized that the band actually didn't have a male singer or rapper at all. But none of that ended up being true. Their second single, Going Under, was also a hit, followed by My Immortal, a song that really showed that the band wasn't just like a nu metal band with a girl singer, which was for the most part how they were categorized based on the first 2 singles. And I think even to an Evanescence hater, if you listen to My Immortal, you can't deny that this is just a great song that in particular really showcases what an incredible vocalist Amy Lee is. That song even crossed over into the adult contemporary charts, and I think really solidified their status as one of the biggest upcoming stars in rock. And the truth is that it really was not at all an overnight success, because the band had actually been together for over 10 years at this point, but to a mainstream audience, it definitely looked that way from the outside. And before I go on, I do want to talk about why they had so much success so quickly. For one, even though the band is sort of thought of as quote-unquote nu metal, these are just legitimately great songs that transcend genre or time. Like, there's probably still 8th graders playing My Immortal at their piano recitals because the song is just that good. Just like how you'll still hear high school marching bands playing Green Day songs. Because again, they're just so good that they transcend genre, time, trends, or any of that. The songs were beautiful and haunting, but also heavy. They were dark and touching, but not like overly down and mopey, and they really didn't sound like anything else out there, at least to a mainstream audience. Like, yes, of course, there were those gothic and symphonic metal bands out there, like Nightwish and Epica, who were doing something kind of similar, but at least at that time, those were like very underground bands. And so to most people, this idea of combining metal with synths and piano and Amy's style of vocals was like totally unheard of. And secondly, Amy herself has that really rare combination of star power and musical ability that again crosses all kinds of boundaries. She was very relatable to all the girls who looked up to her, but also appealed to a male audience in a way that, say, like Avril Lavigne just never did. And of course, she also happens to be very good looking, which never hurts in terms of marketability. She's really just like a super charismatic person that just about anybody can connect with in some way. Her lyrics were also very relatable. A lot of it focused on the kind of relationship struggles that pretty much anybody can relate to. And she brought an element of like softness and vulnerability to nu metal, which for the most part was very like aggressive, dark male energy. I also think she deserves a lot of credit for her aesthetic and fashion. I'm not saying that she single-handedly invented the goth girl look or anything like that, but when it comes to a mainstream audience, she kind of did. Like, who was doing that on MTV before Amy Lee? And I think it's also worth noting that there's not some stylist behind that. She actually designs a lot of her own clothes.
I usually just do a big round of designs right before we go on tour and get some stuff going, so I have my own look on stage.
And so you put all of that together, the songs, the look, and Amy as just this super charismatic, visionary person. It's the total package. So of course they blew up once they were finally able to get a label's marketing machine behind them. But even with all that success, there were just as many challenges for the band.
I was talking to journalists and people backstage at shows and radio stations all the time, like every day, and having to kind of go through the motions and act like everything was great. Like, please buy into this, believe in us, everything's great. But inside thinking like, I don't know, actually it might all be falling apart.
For one, her brother was at home dealing with his severe epilepsy while she had to be out on the road. There was also the increasing divide between her and their guitarist, Ben Moody, who she started the band with. And he suddenly left the band in 2003 in the middle of their European tour. And aside from just being their guitarist, which was already significant, he was also the co-founder and Amy's main writing partner. So losing him like that was a huge shakeup for the band. There was also quite a bit of controversy at that time around their status as a Christian band, which I find pretty interesting as an example of how this dynamic worked in general back then. And regardless of what they would say in the media years later, the fact is that the band absolutely had ties to the Christian metal scene. I remember thinking of them as a Christian band. A lot of other people did too. They came up playing church shows. They had guest vocals by Bruce from the Christian thrash metal band Living Sacrifice on Origin. They headlined a Christian music conference called Provident. They were signed to the same label as Creed, which a lot of people I think have forgotten were kind of a Christian adjacent band. They absolutely knew what they were doing and made specific efforts to market themselves to the Christian audience, which makes perfect sense because especially back then, the Christian scene was an incredibly powerful market for a band. Christian bookstores alone could move tens of thousands of copies of any album that made it to those shelves, especially for metal bands because of all the parents out there who wouldn't let their kids listen to anything but Christian metal. And what ended up causing a lot of trouble for them is before he left the band, Ben Moody did an interview with Entertainment Weekly where he said, "We're actually high on the Christian charts," and I'm like, what the fuck are we even doing there? And it's kind of funny in hindsight that this would be such a big deal, but saying fuck was apparently un-Christian behavior, and the band was pulled from Christian distribution channels, despite the fact that Amy was still vocally a Christian in the press. And so after even more lineup changes and a live album, there were a lot of questions about the future of the band. As Amy put it, the label had the same fears and suspicions that many people did after Ben left the band, that he'd pretty much done everything but sing and I couldn't do it without him. But the band answered all of that with their second album, The Open Door, in 2006, which debuted at #1 on Billboard and proved that they were here to stay. This album included one of the band's biggest singles to this day, Call Me When You're Sober, which was about her ex-boyfriend, Sean Morgan of Seether, and his struggles with addiction. And there was even more drama in the form of more lineup changes. By 2008, Evanescence had become basically Amy with a revolving door of members. And normally when I see that, it's a sign of weakness, of somebody who's difficult to get along with, or otherwise is a problem. But in this case, I actually don't see things that way. As Amy put it, "It took me a while to figure out who I was. I'm the youngest person in the band, I'm the leader of the band, and I'm a chick. I learned how to say no and draw boundaries." So what I see here is Amy understanding who she is, that she is the leader of the band, and her job is to do whatever it takes to bring her vision to life. And so with all of that going on, the band took 5 years to release their next album, Evanescence, in 2011, which you don't really hear people talk about very often, but is actually a pretty great album. And shortly after that, the band announced that they would be taking a break, which of course normally means we're breaking up. But in this case, it really was a break, a pretty long one. But they returned in 2017 with an album called Synthesis, which I think is actually really interesting. It's all songs from their back catalog, but rearranged for piano and orchestra with some kind of cinematic electronic elements. And I think of this as an album that like really only Evanescence could do, or at least do well, because it really goes back to Amy's roots in classical music and film scoring, and also highlights her incredible voice, which to this day is pretty unique in the genre. Wake me up inside, call my name and save me. Which brings us to their most recent album, The Bitter Truth, from 2021, which really almost felt like a modern update to Fallen. And I would say it's actually pretty damn good, especially for a band that is now over 20 years into their career. And so the last question is, what is Evanescence's lasting impact and influence? Well, the first thing to me is that they were one of the biggest gateway bands of the 2000s as far as getting people into rock and metal. And a lot of those people would end up going on to be lifelong fans of the genre. And I think that was especially true for two groups of people who didn't really feel represented by bands like, say, Slipknot or Limp Bizkit, which would be women and Christians. Like, how many Christian youth group girls were out there who were maybe kind of alternative, but didn't really feel welcome in the scene, but then they saw Amy, who was maybe kind of the person that they wished they could be, and that is what ended up getting them into metal. And second, I think maybe more than any other band, they played a huge role in getting gothic or symphonic metal on the radar for a mainstream audience. And I'm not really sure if bands like Epica or Amaranth or Lacuna Coil were influenced by Evanescence or not. But either way, Evanescence is absolutely responsible for a big chunk of that genre's relevance, because they introduced that sound to literally tens of millions of people who otherwise would never have heard it, as well as popularizing that like goth metal kind of fashion aesthetic. And so ultimately, I think Evanescence actually has a much bigger legacy than what you often hear in the media. But I do think that they are increasingly getting the respect that honestly, they always deserved. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, if you haven't, please check out my Patreon. Patrons get every podcast a week early. I do Q&As, I do some giveaways, I do some other stuff. There's also a way to have me review your music if you're interested in that. So if any of that sounds cool to you, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.